Welcome to the C Files. Christians, those of you who call yourself Christians, you need to listen to this one. Folks, most of what you're seeing on YouTube is garbage because it doesn't get to the root of the problems that we're facing in society. They'll talk about Second Amendment issues. They'll talk about the issue on the southern border. They'll talk about getting into another war. They'll talk about Biden and his administration, but they don't get to the root of what is happening in society. There's two books you need to get if you want to understand what's happening in the world today. The first one is this one. Let me see if I can turn it this way for you. And it's called The Rise of the Fourth Reich. I found this one in Barnes & Nobles under the new books. Rise of the Fourth Reich by Steve Deese and Daniel Horowitz. This one will tell you what happened medically with the doctors, nurses, pharmacists, and the hospitals during the pandemic. And if you read it, it will infuriate you concerning what they were doing. If justice isn't done when it comes to those things that occurred, God will have his justice, because it was pure evil. The second one is called the Committee of 300. Looks like this. I don't know if you can see it. This light is blocking it out. There it is. The Committee of 300. Okay? And I wanted to read a portion of this to you. And the reason is because as I'm reading through this, you're going to hear things that you're going to go, wait a minute. What? That's stuff they're talking about today. And it'll help you understand from the foundational, fundamental level why things are occurring today that are occurring. I hope I have your attention. Let's begin. This is chapter 3. An awakening, getting to know some secret societies. Now let's take a look at this. He says, my in-depth studies at the British Museum, London, provided a great deal of enlightenment, and I was helped along by access to documents not available to the general public. Slowly at first, I was led to a conclusion that there was a major player somewhere with the reach and power to direct the many secret societies that plagued our world. Papers and documents made available had a profound effect, particularly a report on the speech by the Reverend Robert T. Frericks, delivered to the American Baptist Convention on July the 9th, 1963. Now, this is written by Dr. John Coleman, and he was a CIA operative for his entire career. Okay? So this is not someone who doesn't have a clue what they're talking about. Now this is the first part about the American Baptists. The American Baptist Convention was then the most radical of the Christian sects. Harold Stason was the president of the convention that year. The Reverend Robert T. Frericks was the keynote speaker, and the thrust of what he said was much in agreement with the thinking of the Reverend Thomas Malthus. Too many people consuming too few natural resources. Does that sound familiar? It's the same thing they're pushing on us today to try and get their way. It's a form of mind manipulation and control. Malthus, the son of an English country parson, was an employee of the East India Company, which, by the way, was one of those secrets, well, not so secret, it was a society that was pushing globalism of its day. who had raised concerns 150 years earlier about the population explosion that brought about surplus population. 150 years ago, they were concerned about population explosion. Why? As we go through this, we're going to answer that question. It was a position taken by the Illuminists of the day and carried through to the 20th century by their descendants. Quote, overpopulation and, quote, lack of education were mentioned in this speech, which also includes references to a corporate world. We should live in what, for a better word, we call a corporate or cooperative or collective society. Code word for communism. This was the view held by the philosophical radicals Jeremy Bentham, William Allen, and 100 years later, Harold Mackinder and Lord Bertrand Russell, that famous atheist of the 20th century, or 19th century. Mackinder failed to say that it called for a fascist state, to paraphrase Benito Mussolini. The solution, according to Russell, was to wipe out the excess population by means of disease, plague, pandemics. Did you hear that? I'll read it again, because that's exactly what they are doing today. The solution, according to Russell, was to wipe out the excess population by means of disease, plague, pandemics. This was their plan. They've been planning this a long time, folks. In today's United States and Britain, Russell would have been smeared as racist. But in his day, Russell was revered and respected, an elder statesman of the successor of the East India Company, later the British East India Company. Lord Russell was merely perpetuating the Olympian, or Committee of 300, belief that they had the right to make such judgments. Does it sound familiar? Does it sound like Trudeau? Does it sound like Soros? Does it sound like Klaus Schwab? Does it sound like Yuval Noah Harari? And this is getting caught up somehow. Okay, let's do that. Does it sound like them? They got it from their predecessors. Lord Russell was merely perpetuating the Olympian belief that they had the right to make such judgments and carry out their deliberations. In America, there arose several divisions within the Christian church with marked socialist tendencies. The American Baptist Convention had its headquarters on Riverside Drive, New York, fairly close to the Rockefeller Riverside Church. Rockefeller, remember Rockefeller. It was the most left-wing of all Christian churches in the U.S. at that time. The Reverend Frericks was a radical preacher who predicted that the United States would become a corporate society. And there are many today claiming that that's exactly what has happened to the United States. He also held that a third to a half of the population would no longer be needed. Isn't that what they're saying in the World Economic Forum today? And the UN is pushing the same agenda? As if by coincidence, of course, we know it was not, on the day following Helen Henley's article on the American Country Life Association Conference, the Christian Science Monitor confirmed the position of the Committee of 300. Only radical changes will contain the population explosion threatening 2/3 of humanity. Of course, we can assume that the descendants of the East India Company knew that they were in the 1/3 group that would not suffer drastic diminution of its population group. Diminution meaning a thinning out of it, a decrease of it. Professor Andrew Hacker's speech toward a corporate America, given before the American Political Science Association conference at the Commodore Hotel in New York on September 6, 1963, also played a big role in shaping my perspective. Quote, "It may be that two Americas are emerging, one a society protected by the corporate umbrella, and the other a society whose members have failed to affiliate themselves with the dominant institution. The second America, in part, will consist of small businessmen and other independent spirits who manage to do well without corporate attachments." That's the ones they tried to destroy during this last pandemic. "It will be comprised of the unemployed, the ill-educated, and the entire residue of human beings who are not needed by the corporate machine." End quote. And that's the New York Times, September the 7th, 1963. Oh, it gets better. Some gnat flying around me. Much more detail about the beginning of the British East India Company, the forerunner of the 300, has been included in this book. The turning point of my convictions came with the papers of the East India Company, the British Museum, which provided in unmistakable terms the great clarity, the history, and secret agenda of the company and its successors. India House in London was the headquarters of the East India Company. Its parent was the London Mercers Company, fathered by the London Staplers, was granted its charter in 1600 by Queen Elizabeth I. In this grouping is found the black nobility banking families of Venice and Genoa. Among these families' names is Sebastian Cabot, the ancestor of these liberal establishments' Cabot family. These companies are all traceable to the Levant trading merchants of Venice and Genoa's most ancient commercial groups. India House, up until 1929, contained all the secrets of the earliest beginnings of the 300 and the New World Order, but was firmly closed to outsiders. We can tell our readers that a sister company associated with the Levant Company, run by the Venetian black nobility, called the London Company, was granted a royal charter in 1606 to establish the Virginia plantation on a socialist model that closely resembled communist principles. By the way, that experiment failed miserably. This was excuse me. This was the start of what was to become the Eastern liberal establishment, and its family members were allowed to participate in the China opium trade, from which vast fortunes were amassed. Folks, we live in such a wicked, evil world when it comes to those who move and shake and control things. Just pure evil. It was also the beginning of the spiritual conflict that has bedeviled the United States ever since a number of the brethren established themselves in the American colonies in New England. They were members of the Rite of Swedenborg, Gnostic, Rosicrucian, Unitarians, and Humanists. Almost 300 years later, the most important of these families was the Rockefellers, who owned and controlled the Rockefeller Standard Oil dynasty. It was this network that was used by the 300 to usher in the Fabian Socialist New Deal via Roosevelt and dispossess the American people of their gold. Most of these, and by the way, they told the American people to turn their gold in. They confiscated gold. Don't think they won't do that again. Those of you who are buying a bunch of gold, if they succeed in gaining their power over you, they're going to confiscate all your gold, and all of that effort won't mean anything. Most of these families, while outwardly professing to be Christians, were pantheist, Gnostic, Rosicrucian, deistic Unitarians. In other words, they weren't Christians. Their philosophy was very markedly socialist. This is best understood when we consider that the ancestors of some of these families could be traced back to the Anabaptists and Wycliffe Lollards, whose politics were distinctly communist. Now that sentence shocked me. I never in a million years would have considered Anabaptists or Wycliffe Lollards to be communistic. Wycliffe translated the Bible into English. He was a translator. Just mind-boggling. Anyway, their politics were distinctly communist, according to this. There exists a school of thought that there may have been elements of the Bogomils among them who fled to the New World from the Balkans during the Inquisition, and also some descendants of the Khazars, a barbaric race of Indo-Turk origin. I'm sure there'll be more about the Khazars as we go along. The Rockefeller family and the Astor family are believed to have immigrated to the U.S. from Asia Minor, with this mixture of races and alien cultures dating back to the Manichaeans. He says the source for that was Rockefeller Internationalist by Emmanuel Josephson, 1952. Now we get into a very interesting thing here, because all of these people who are talking about a rapture, a future tribulation period, and dispensationalism, this next paragraph is not going to bode well with you. You're not going to like it. The East India Company and the British East India Company men had a habit of giving grants to Christian evangelicals. Rockefeller and his fellow travelers followed suit, fostering evangelical Christianity to hide their true intentions. Just because someone gives money to a good cause doesn't mean that they're good people. Sometimes they're playing a psyop, which was to attain political power in the United States. That was their intention, was to gain political power by giving to those who would grant them that power. And then around the world, as old John Dee was to demonstrate. In the United States, the Christian fundamentalist sect introduced by British East India's John Nelson Darby was called dispensation or dispensationalism. John Nelson Darby was a deep state globalist. I thought maybe there would have been a connection somehow, but I didn't have any kind of a connection I could point to. But just the way dispensationalism has destroyed, or not destroyed, but it's really disrupted heavily the advancement of God's kingdom, it seemed to me that somehow it would have been connected to some kind of a sinister ploy by the globalist. Apparently this is the case. And those of you who buy into that theology, that futurist, dispensationalist, premillennial theology, my statement right then, I'm sure, angered you and made you upset. But take time to look into it. In China, it was the China Inland Mission. And in South Africa, prior to the Anglo-Boer War, it was the London Mission Society. They gave rise to the war by meddlesome political interference clothed in Christian religious robes. Isn't it always? This stuff these wars we're trying to get into in the Middle East today, same thing. It's just clothed in Christian religious robes of dispensationalism. And in my estimation, It's doing a ton of damage, and it's wrong, and we need to stop. All of these Christian organizations appear to have been well funded. The Quakers established communist-like communes during the Revolutionary War and enjoyed strong financial support from William Aldrich, an ancestor of Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller, and Stephen Hopkins. In the 1940s and 1950s, it was a sector of the Presbyterian Church that played a larger-than-life role in shaping U.S. domestic and foreign policy through John Foster and Allen Dulles. So there's sects of Presbyterianism that are not biblical, and they're not Bible-believing Christians. In the South, by the way, there are sects that are very biblical and very Bible-believing. So, it goes both ways. Depending on what sect it is. In the South, the Presbyterian Church was the main backer and supporter of two black universities. The thrust of the policies of the early East India Company and the London Company preceded the London staplers and propounded by their papers was that individual man mattered little outside of their framework and their visions of the New World Order. The individual man mattered little outside of their framework and their visions of the New World Order. You know what I thought of when I thought of it? I'm a big Star Trek fan. I like watching it. This is the Borg. It's the collective. The Borg are the communists of the Star Trek universe. Okay? They're the globalists of the Star Trek universe. They assimilate everybody. And they want to control everybody. And the individual is irrelevant. It's irrelevant to the Borg. There is no individualism. Not allowed. It's irrelevant. And it's a great cinematic view of the globalists that are trying to kill individualism today and trying to destroy the family, trying to destroy morality, ethics, virtue. I'll continue. The East India Company, the British East India Company, and their successor, the 300, operated on the premise that they were the Olympians, destined to control man and the planet, which already in the 17th century, was showing signs of disintegration, largely due to overpopulation that had to be corrected. In other words, they could not succeed with their sinister plans if there was too many people on the planet. And that's the reason for all of the overpopulation talk that came out of the 60s and continues today. Has nothing to do with saving the planet, has nothing to do with saving humanity, has everything to do with reducing the population to just enough people that they could control and turn into their little slaves. That's all it has to do with. I'm almost done. The East India men did not believe that man was created by God for social interaction and mutual protection. Their thinkers, and of course we believe that. We believe that God made man in his image and that there are individuals and that God honors them. God, they're image bearers of God. God made them in his image, and so therefore they have value. They have value under God's economy. Their thinkers dismissed the notion out of hand that man would have value. Man had to be controlled and regulated. And so they took it upon themselves to become the caretaker of man's well-being. Klaus Schwab and the boys, right there. with disastrous consequences. And we're seeing it again. The consequences are disastrous. In short, mankind fell into the hands of a group of evil men who controlled society, an instrument of malicious oppression, whose policies were enacted by front governments, in other words, fake governments, which some could argue that our current government here in the United States is compromised. Fake governments, composed of officials the people thought they had voted in the office. We think we vote them in the office, but it's all a ruse. It's all fake. Their cousins in the United States were not only affluent, but also well educated. By 1905, their descendants had set up a socialist network in the U.S. founded by Clarence Darrow, Upton Sinclair, and Morris Hillquit, who would become household names in the U.S., and all of whom were directly controlled by the Committee of 300, with the exception of Clarence Darrow. Last portion. Prominent among the East India men was John Mildenhall, who arrived at Agra in India in 1603 to obtain a concession from the Mughals to trade in opium. They've always been big in the drug trade because it makes them a lot of money. Do you think the drug cartels are independent? They're controlled by the globalists. There are governments involved in the drug cartels because it's all about the money. But the Mughal kept him waiting until 1608, when Robert Clive, known as Clive of India, and William Watson waged war against Mughal Mir Jafar, forcing him to grant to the East India Company on October 22nd, 1765, total control over revenues in Benares, Bengal, and Bihar, the most lucrative opium areas in all of India. Many of the highest-ranking officials of the East India Company and its successors were men of deep socialist beliefs drawn from secret societies. Fabian socialism, among whose earliest members were George Bernard Shaw and Richard Potter, who was a very wealthy man who wrote mystic and witchcraft stories, one of which was turned into a book called Harry Potter by the Tavistock Institute, primarily for children as an introduction to witchcraft. It's a form of indoctrination. Wow. Tavistock Institute did a ton of research into mind control, and they've been very successful with it. Other members were Stafford Cripps, who became foreign minister, Bertrand Russell, and Annie Besant, a prominent theosophist. Here's a name you'll know. H.G. Wells played a leading role in shaping policies at home and foreign policies of the British East India Company, policies that inflicted severe damage upon the young American Republic. Folks, we need to get our head out of the sand. Stop watching all the YouTube videos. I mean, obviously this is a YouTube video, but it's not for entertainment. In other words, it's not me doing some kind of silly stuff, some trivial garbage to make money. Get the books that tell you what is actually really happening in our world. and read them. And this one, Holy Bible, is the most important one, the primary one. You believe in the Bible? Oh, you're just believing ignorant superstitions. I'm going to have some words for you folks that think that way too. And you're not going to like it. Because it's not going to be superficial. I like hitting the bullseye. And I'm going to hit it. And you guys are going to squirm. You're going to hate me for it. Thanks for watching the C-Files. For those of you who want to know the truth, who want to dig deeper, who want to make the world a better place, thanks for watching. God bless. We'll see you next time.